So I'm delighted to be joined by David Pearce, who's a leading transhumanist, the co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association, which is now Humanity Plus in 1998. So David, thank you very much for your time. So the first thing I wanted to ask is, how much has the transhumanist movement changed since 1998 when you founded the World Transhumanist Association?
Good heavens, what a question. Well, back in 1998, the human genome hadn't been decoded. Most talk of superintelligence was of people taking smart drugs and the like, and something like radical life extension was still firmly in the realm of crank alley. And Whereas back in 1998, when Nick Bostrom and I founded the World Transhumanist Association, one could use a slogan like the three transhumanist supers, i.e. super happiness, super intelligence, and super longevity, but they really were slogans. Whereas I think now some of the technical challenges faced by transhumanism, one is less likely to get the response, well, that's just crazy, that's impossible. One can disagree over timescales. I mean, something like radical life extension. Are you and I likely to benefit from quasi-immortal lifespans, or is it something for our grandchildren? But the purely technical obstacles to transhumanism, I would say some of them are diminishing. We're already seeing the first very controversial, of course, CRISPR genome edited babies in China, not in ideal circumstances, but something like for instance, the New Yorker magazine for January, its headline was "A World Without Pain." Now, okay, 20 years ago, that would probably seem like utopian dreaming, and for a lot of your listeners, probably it still seems like utopian dreaming. But nonetheless, one can at least sketch in much greater detail how this kind of scenario could actually come to pass.
I mean, how do you think the wider society, the way it kind of treats the transhumanist movement has changed?
Some people will associate transhumanism predominantly with the so-called intelligence explosion, kind of computers. Other people will focus on radical life extension, whether Aubrey de Grey and SENS, or for that matter, cryonics. And the particular strand of transhumanism that I represent, I'm most interested in, this is the idea that we can use biotechnology to phase out suffering via genetic engineering, not just in humans, but also in non-human animals. And something like cultured meat, for example, 20 years ago, it was science fiction, whereas now we're seeing the first products, something like the coronavirus outbreak, which is threatening a pandemic. It just wouldn't happen if it weren't for meat eating. And it may well be that something like this imminent viral pandemic is going to lead not strictly to global veganism, but veganism and in vitrotarianism. Many different strands to the transhumanist movement. But if one focuses on shall we say, the three core supers, there has been significant progress over the past 2 decades.
I mean, what do you think are the main obstacles that the transhumanist movement still faces? I mean, they're both kind of technological, but also potentially kind of political or societal.
Well, let's take the three supers. Even though it is now possible, in principle, to replace today's genetic crapshoot with designer babies, there is tremendous status quo bias, and most people will intend to continue having babies naturally. And if one talks about genome editing so that people can have naturally high hedonic set points, high pain thresholds, so that babies have a naturally high quality of life, this conjures up visions of coercive eugenics in the 20th century. So most people are understandably extremely cautious. But I think the important thing to acknowledge is that all babies born today are unique genetic experiments. And if one does think it's ethically justifiable to bring new sentient life into the world, I think one has an obligation to load the genetic dice. And already one can see particular genes that predispose to essentially, yes, to being temperamentally optimistic, cheerful, very low sensitivity to pain. This could radically improve the quality of life of our children and grandchildren. But of course, most people are still extremely wary and cautious. Okay, that's the, shall we say, the abolitionist strand of transhumanism, super happiness. In terms of super longevity, yeah, one can't yet promise people any kind of miracle wonder therapy radically to extend lifespans. There are a number of interesting drugs, possible gene therapies, and so forth. But it's a promissory note, and I think to some extent, essentially, people like to kind of rationalize their own aging and mortality, and there is. Yes, there's almost something cruel about telling people that science is going to find a cure for aging a few decades after you're dead. But this is it. There are two strands to defeating aging. One, yes, is the biological approach, but transhumanists also advocate the use of cryonics, and maybe, but this would be extremely controversial, cryoeuthanasia. So if you want to, shall we say, wake up in the year 2200 or something, and see what's going on, and you don't want to die, but you reckon that you're probably going to not make it, then yes, you can sign up for cryonics. And I think if you're suspended in optimal conditions, so long as critical information is not lost, it should be possible to reanimate you. Okay, this is speculative, but then so is the afterlife promised by traditional religion.
I mean, presumably something like that would require. Sorry, is your voice thing gone a bit weird? My audio.
No, I probably put my finger in the wrong place. Is this better? Yes.
Not to worry. Presumably something like that would require legislative change. And that would mean the transhumanist movement engaging in politics. And one thing I noticed is the transhumanist movement does seem to be engaging more in politics. So obviously you've got things like, Zoltanist demand presidential. I spoke a few days ago about his latest bid. The Transhumanist Party UK, you started to have transhumanists standing for election. I mean, how do you think transhumanists should kind of work with the political world to get what they want?
Yeah, should transhumanists get actively engaged in politics, a transhumanist party, or should we hope that the leading parties steal our clothes? Not that they're mutually exclusive. I have to say that personally, I'm a writer. Yes, I am not psychologically equipped to engage in the rough and tumble of politics, which is proverbially a pretty brutal business. But hats off to transhumanists in the UK, the United States, and elsewhere who are engaging with the political world. So yeah, I think a twin track approach. Realistically, the Transhumanist Party is not going to be seizing the levers of power anytime soon. But nonetheless, the influence of transhumanist ideas way exceeds the influence of self-avowed transhumanists. So yes, encouraging.
I mean, do you think it matters whether the technologies that transhumanists are advocating, so obviously in terms of things like AI and robotics, gene editing, whether they emerge first in a liberal democratic country like, the United States of America or Western Europe, or in China? Do you think that could have a very big bearing on kind of how the future plays out, and whether it's an authoritarian future or a more democratic future?
Yes, there are, shall we say, troubling developments in the United States that make one a little wary about talking of straightforward liberal democracy, but without getting too involved in current American shenanigans, yes, do we anticipate a transhumanist future primarily being driven by the liberal democracies, or alternatively the Chinese model? It may well be, for example, I take this case of gene-edited babies that cause so much controversy. Now, it seems that as an alleged accidental byproduct of the particular piece of engineering in question, at least in animal models, that the animals with this particular mutation have superior memory and may well be intellectually enhanced. And I have a suspicion that the scientist in question was actually trying to create more intelligent, smarter babies with the HIV story as a cover. Now, of course, it may just be a coincidence that in so-called animal models, mice with the relevant gene are smarter, but I'm personally quite skeptical. Now, yes, this is it. You see, the Chinese haven't got the same historical memories as we've got in the West of eugenics, and it may well be that they decide, well, yes, what is wrong with actually loading the genetic dice of creating smarter babies? And my worry, I suppose, would be more that instead of focusing on the well-being of individuals, instead it would be some kind of collective attempt to raise intelligence. Now, I've no objection per se in creating babies that are extremely intelligent. I think the risk, however, is that one will have an extremely narrowly defined conception of intelligence, the kind of the autistic dimension of intelligence measured by IQ tests, rather than an all-round, empathetic, full spectrum superintelligence. So yes, I mean, a proper answer to your question would take a long disquisition, but yeah, it's going to make a big difference whether it is China driving transhumanist technologies or the United States. Just one more point. I mean, in the case of something like radical life extension, I suspect all the kind of any kind of ideological opposition would be swept away by the first successful intervention. One already sees how some new anti-aging, anti-wrinkle cream is swept off the stores in Boots or what have you. And if interventions are devised to radically extend healthy life, all that kind of ideological opposition or status quo bias will just dissipate, I think.
Yeah. I mean, one argument I found quite interesting, so I think it's kind of the Francis Fukuyama argument. So I think you wrote an article, and I think it was something like 2004, in which he argued that transhumanism could be a threat to liberal democracy because the disparity between human intellect will become such that people won't be prepared to share power on a one-person, one-vote basis. So you have kind of, people with huge enhanced intellect won't be comfortable sharing power on a one-person, one-vote basis with someone like me who's unenhanced. I was wondering what you think about that. Do you think that transhumanism potentially threatens our current kind of democratic model?
I see all manner of challenges, but I wouldn't consider that question very likely, because this is it. I think a lot of people are worried that only the rich and powerful are going to benefit from transhumanist technologies. But the whole point of the IT revolution in genome sequencing is that the cost is effectively going to collapse. And soon everyone who wants to will be able to have their genome sequenced. Everyone who wants to will be able to, in a sense, design with suitable counseling their own offspring. So yes, I'm worried. I'm less worried on that score.
I mean, in terms of kind of where we go from here, what do you think the world will look like in sort of, say, 30 or 40 years' time? I know it's a horrible question and quite vague, but what kind of things are you looking forward to?
Personally, I'm looking forward most to the abolition of factory farming and slaughterhouses. Yes, our victims are as sentient and sapient as small children, and I think grandchildren, not just post-human superintelligence, but our grandchildren will look back on what we are doing to non-humans as quite unspeakable. Um, and in that sense, I'm very encouraged by the growth of cultured meat and alternatives. And I think people are going to be much more willing to consider the moral arguments against factory farming and slaughterhouses when it doesn't cause any personal inconvenience. So yes, I would guess that by the middle of the century, factory farms and slaughterhouses are going to be outlawed, that cultured meat products, probably called by something much fancier, cruelty-free meat, different products of a taste and texture that is indistinguishable from existing products, will be ubiquitous. People, the root term is virtue signaling. They will be very keen to signal their fundamental decency. And so in that sense, I think there is going to be a moral revolution in our treatment of non-humans. But in the case of the difference with human society, I would hope that by the middle of this century, it will be possible to start ratcheting up the hedonic set points, not just of future babies, but also existing humans. Now, I think most of us, looking ahead 30, 40 years, our dotage would anticipate inexorable decline, which may or may not be the case. But in terms of subjective quality of life, as we understand our reward circuitry and find ways to raise hedonic set points, I think, yes, that should transform quality of life. Notice I'm talking about raising hedonic set points rather than happiness. If it's just simply a case of making everyone happy, one could in principle do this now, this kind of indiscriminate bliss or wireheading. But the challenge is to allow people to be happier and fulfilled without compromising social responsibility, intellectual performance, without adjudicating between conflicting preferences. Now, yeah, in terms of predicting what's going to happen in the next 30, 40 years, I'm assuming that there isn't some global catastrophe, whether war or a terrible pandemic. Obviously, there are so many unknowns, but yes, I perhaps am cautiously optimistic.
I mean, as I say, I've been speaking to a lot of transhumanists. So I spoke to Zoltan Istvan a few days ago, and one thing he said, which I thought was very interesting, I wanted to ask you about, is that he thought a kind of divide had been emerging within the movement between the more libertarian transhumanists and perhaps the more statist or left-wing transhumanists. I mean, part of the reason why he's standing for the Republican nomination was he wants to increase interest amongst conservatives in transhumanist ideas. I wonder whether you thought there'd been any kind of divergence between the two, and if so, kind of what that says about the movement.
Yes, I mean, when is this back ancient history in 1998 when Nick approached me about the possibility of setting up what was called the World Transhumanist Association, I associated transhumanism exclusively with the kind of free market fundamentalism. And though, I mean, in one sense, it's preposterous, this idea that one draws a line left and right and calls some people left-wing and some right-wing. Nonetheless, yes, one can see particular tensions there. And I'll be honest, my gut instincts, I've always identified with the weak, the meek, the poor, the bunny rabbits, in a sense, the underdog. And yet the whole experience of 20th century history and the Soviet experiment have polluted the entire language of social justice. So, yes, although there are certainly political tensions between what may be very crudely called left and right in the transhumanist movement. Um, I wouldn't necessarily see them as fundamental. I think Zoltan is extremely shrewd. Now, the idea a few years ago that transhumanism could ever appeal to Republicans would just fantastical. But then, on the other hand, the Republican Party was the party of fiscal prudence and standing up to Russia. So yes, we live in interesting times, shall we say?
I like the artificial wombs solution to abortion. I think that's quite neat, I thought.
Well, yes, this is it. People will occasionally say, but as a vegan, do you support abortion and something? And it's an incredibly difficult issue, but it may well be that yes, artificial wombs are coming soon. Yes.
I mean, do you worry at all about the potential reaction to kind of the transhumanist revolution? I mean, I imagine there'll be some people who'll be very uncomfortable with, these changes happening at all, possibly for religious reasons, possibly for some other ethical reason. I mean, do you think it could almost become kind of, the extent to which we can modify the human body will become one or perhaps even the biggest political divide in, say, 40, 50 years' time?
Oh, good heavens. Yes, anticipating the sociology of life 40 and 50 years is even harder in some ways than anticipating the technology. It would be different if transhumanists were advocating, kind of coercive use of these technologies, forcing people to kind of radical life extension or super happiness or anything like that. But transhumanism, all strands of transhumanism, are very libertarian in one sense, in that essentially it's a matter of extending people's opportunities. I mean, at the moment, people have no choice about involuntary suffering, aging, all kinds of intellectual disabilities. But in principle, yes, transhumanism should benefit all sentient beings. And although that sounds incredibly utopian, it's there in the Transhumanist Declaration, commitment to the well-being of all sentience. And yeah, I mean, I've had a number of vigorous discussions with bioconservatives, but often it really boils down to this question of choice and consent. And yeah, I would simply ask anyone who is strongly opposed to the whole transhumanist movement, do you think that when radical anti-aging therapies become available, and when any kind of suffering or unpleasant experience is technically optional, whether you would force people to suffer or force people to grow old or forbid people from using neural implants so that they can have, in a sense, super intelligence on a chip.
I mean, I guess the concern some people might have would be kind of the distribution of power. So if some people start having hugely enhanced intellect, I presume that would have some kind of real world impact in terms of kind of power and influence. And the people who are left behind might be, I mean, left behind in the sense that they don't feel comfortable with the technology, might rather than no one have that technology, if that makes sense.
It's possible. A lot depends on how one conceives of radical intellectual enhancement. If one conceives it as simply having an off-the-scale IQ, and if in this very narrow sense, then yes, it's very restrictive. But if you think broadly transhumanist technologies will enrich our capacity for empathetic understanding, social cognition, cooperative problem solving, the kind of intellectual capacity that helped drive the evolution of distinctively human intelligence, then I'm more optimistic, because yeah, I think we need a much richer conception of intelligence than we have now. And ideally, yes, one can have, let's say, a kind of naturalized telepathy, perhaps, so I can understand to a much greater extent what you're thinking and feeling. I think the possibility of this is probably much more futuristic. The idea of some kind of reversible thalamic bridge. The conjoined Hogan sisters today share a thalamic bridge and can partially they can actually experience each other's thoughts and feelings, and in future it might be possible to rig up something like that so you and I could do the equivalent of a Vulcan mind meld. Okay, that's probably more than 30 or 40 years away, but it's the kind of example how how full spectrum superintelligence will be far richer than anything imagined by today's simplistic IQ tests.
One interesting argument I've heard from a few transhumanists, I kind of want to run by you, is the argument that obviously our kind of current biology, I mean, we evolved in a very different society to one we currently live in. We have hardware which is fundamentally designed for a very different way of living. So obviously we're quite tribal, we're quite violent sometimes, and those things may have made sense in the society in which we evolved, but they don't necessarily make sense in a world of nuclear weapons. And a number of transhumanists have told me that they think that unmodified, the human species will eventually destroy itself. Our kind of capacity for violence and tribalism combined with our new scientific innovation in nuclear weapons and so on means that unless some kind of transhumanist revolution happens, the human race will inevitably eventually self-destruct. I just wondered what you thought about that argument.
Yes, it's quite good. In a sense, evolution designed us for example, male human primates to form coalitions with each other and wage war against other coalitions of male human primates. And I mean, one can see this even today. How do even kind of pacifists like spending their recreational time at sort of violent video games? Whether we will have time, in a sense, to re-engineer ourselves so that we are no longer, essentially killer apes, I don't know. I think one needs to combine the kind of long-term genetic biological solutions, reprogramming the genome with political fixes. I don't think one can just opt out of fixes. And I mean, most of the terrible wars of the past 2 centuries have been caused fundamentally by nationalism. And as more and more countries acquire WMD, I sadly think it is quite likely this century we're likely to see catastrophic nuclear war, all manner of horrors like that. And I could now, set out my 10-point plan to save the world and so on. It would probably be vaporing in the void. I feel we're sleepwalking our way towards the abyss. I mean, this is it. I could say that I personally think that it would be better if we had a democratically accountable world government, the United Nations, monopoly on the use of force. That there are horrendous risks to having some kind of world state, but equally there are horrendous risks to having nuclear armed states at the mercy of unstable human male primates. So yes, I mean, I should stress that probably most transhumans would not favor the idea of a democratically accountable world government, but I see it as the most realistic way to avoid catastrophic nuclear war. If you think of the circumstances in which the League of Nations and then the United Nations were set up, in the aftermath of catastrophic conflict, I suspect we are eventually going to have some kind of democratically elected world government, but will it be before or after some terrible cataclysm?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I mean, I guess it's kind of related to that, but I've heard the argument a few times that um, there's an argument that the transhumanist revolution needs to be kind of regulated on a species-wide level rather than a nation-state level. And if it's regulated on nation-state level, which is essentially what will be happening now with China and America and Britain and so on, all doing their own thing, the competition between them inevitably means that everything will be used. There won't be any restriction on what people can do. And so potentially the more damaging parts of the transhumanist technology could come into effect. I mean, do you think there's any truth to that? Do you think that the safest way to do the transhumanist revolution is to do it under a kind of one regulatory umbrella as a species?
Personally, yes. Once again, I know that some people this will raise a lot of hackles, and of course one can imagine the totalitarian implications of world states, but equally civilization or what passes for civilization has only been possible in nation states when the state started to claim a monopoly and the use of force and the rule of law. And I think we need the rule of law at the international level. And there are all kinds of decisions, political decisions, that are best taken at a much lower level. But other forms of political decision making, whether climate change, fighting pandemics, say treatment of non-human animals, but especially to a monopoly of the use of force. I think it has to be international, transnational. That yes, we need some kind of global rule of law, and one way to achieve this that wasn't simply utopian dreaming, I think there's no way that existing political leaders are going to surrender their power. But if it were enacted that in, let's say, 20, 30, 40 years' time, that existing political leadership would delegate power to some kind of democratically accountable UN, it just might be feasible. I should stress that I'm in no way speaking for the transhumanist movement as a whole. This is just my personal view, that if we don't address the problem, that we're just likely to stumble into catastrophic nuclear war. Very gloomy thought.
No, I think it's very prescient. I mean, just one final question. If someone's watching this, they want to get involved with the transhumanist movement, or they want to kind of help the movement, I mean, what would you recommend they do?
Oh, heavens. It very much depends on whether any sympathetic listener is focused on one particular issue, such as radical life extension or superintelligence, or the problem of suffering. The transhumanist movement itself, I'll be honest, is incredibly fragmented at the moment. Through the first decade of the century, the World Transhumanist Movement, or now Association, or now Humanity Plus, was the transhumanist organization. But transhumanism the movement has grown, even though it's fragmented. Anyone who's focused on the problem of suffering non-human animals, feel free to drop me a line. If you're concerned with transhumanist politics in the UK, perhaps get in contact with David Wood. Isn't it? People vary in their strengths and their interests. Some people are writers and talkers, and other people are activists. Some people are relaxed about making YouTube videos. Other people are much happier, let's say, donating or contributing. Sorry not to have a one size.
No, that's a great answer. No, so David, it's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed that. So I find the whole subject fascinating. And say thank you very much for your time.
James, what a pleasure. Thank you very much.